Hey everyone, welcome back. Mark chapter 5, the healing of the woman with the issue of blood, the healing of Jairus' daughter. Great morning. Um, Keith, why don't we start with you? Blaze Church down on Long Island. Talk to us a little bit about what yesterday was like.
Yeah. Um, I felt like the most powerful moment in the message was realizing that the woman with the issue of blood, the first word that Jesus said to her was daughter. We spent a lot of time unpacking what that would have felt like, what she would have heard in her spirit, not just her ears, when he said daughter. 12 years of shame. And I kind of pulled on the fact that Jesus could have said anything to her and been justified according to the law. Even in her faith unclean to touch him, the law said it should have rendered him unclean. But she had this faith to say, I believe his cleanness, his power will make me clean. And for him to not throw more shame on her, that was a huge connecting point. It was certainly for me, like just in that moment to say, God doesn't name us by even more than a decade of shame and pain and suffering. When we come to him in faith, we immediately hear, you are now a child of God.
Yeah.
Um, I also kind of brought out the fact that Jesus was so not in a hurry, which messes with us. And I used a quote that Jairus came to him saying, heal my daughter. But in that moment, Jesus was essentially saying, first, I need to heal my daughter. And
Mm,
that was a huge connecting point for people. And then building on that, bringing out that salvation says more than you're not guilty, you can go free. It says you are family and you can stay.
yeah.
The message really kind of that was the middle of it, and it could have just ended there. But we hadn't even gotten to Jairus's daughter dying at that point. Like there was so much more.
Right.
But
Yeah.
I felt like right in the middle of the message, there was such
Yeah.
a beauty and a worship for Jesus and what he does to graft us into his family. So just playing on that word daughter was powerful, powerful.
Yeah, there's multiple encounter moments in this story, right? When Jairus first comes to Jesus, of course, when this woman reaches out to Jesus, and then when Jesus turns to her, and then Jairus again having to re-engage with Jesus on the heels of the news that his daughter has died. And then, of course, the sort of what's supposed to be the climax of the story, but really the story is already so rich. And I think we've all talked about how this was a difficult passage to parse out and to fit into a Sunday morning message because there's just like there are three or four really powerful truths that you could build a whole message on. I think I love what you just said, Keith, and that really landed in our room as well. This idea of faith leading not just to healing but to identity. And but early, like what struck me so early in my reading of the text was just that simple phrase after Jairus comes and falls at Jesus' feet and says, "You come lay your hands on my daughter." Just these five words, and he went, or whatever it was, five or four words, and he went with him.
Yeah.
And I just couldn't get past that idea that like, and what I shared with our church family was that, as far as we know, Jesus didn't ask for more information. He didn't ask for Jairus to make a case stronger than he already had made. He didn't make demands. He didn't. Jesus just went with him, right? But the other thing Jesus didn't do, which I pointed out, which I think is important for us to notice, is Jesus didn't make any promises.
Mm,
And Jesus didn't give any guarantees. He
mm,
didn't say, "Oh, I got it. All right, let's go. I'm going to go heal her." He just goes with her. And I think like we want Jesus to go with us with guarantees, right?
yeah.
With this certainty of the outcome. And yet we have to be okay with him just going with us. And his presence with us has to be more important than what he'll do for us at the end of the journey or during the journey. And, Jairus has to endure delay. I know Dan pushed in on that, or I think it was Dan that pushed in on that topic. I know that we know Jairus is going to have to endure the worst possible moment of a parent's life, which is the news that your daughter has died, right? We read these stories and we don't know what it was like to live in those moments. And all he has to go on is Jesus went with him. And then I kind of got to the point where Jesus turns to Jairus and says, "Don't fear, right? Just believe." And I said, "Well, what does belief look like when you just found out your daughter's dead? What does belief look like on the darkest day of your life?" And I said, "It's not going to look like shouting and screaming and running around the church and worshiping. singing, it's gonna look like just taking one more step, getting out of bed in the morning. And what I sense in that moment is faith for Jairus at that moment was, I will go with you because you said you would go with me. Right.
Yeah.
And sometimes just knowing that Jesus goes with us empowers us to have faith to go with him into the darkness. And so that was like you, I felt like that was our first point. And that's heavy, you know?
Yeah. Yeah.
And I almost felt like, whoa, maybe we should just wrap it and let's just thank Jesus for going with us into our mess.
I talked
But
to some of your
there was
church
so much
attenders,
more.
and they wished you'd have wrapped it too, Dave.
You leave my wife out of this. Oh man. All right. Well, since you just kind of jumped in there, Dan, why don't you
Yeah,
take your turn?
yeah. It's similar to you guys. I, I made the observation that there were two deaths in that story. There was the physical death, obviously, of Jairus's daughter, and there was another death, which is that woman had died socially. She had died among the community in the religious community, of the ceremonies and all of the things that makes that culture and society a community. She was dead, forgotten, sidelined, and basically dead in her shame. And that Jesus did the miraculous work on the one hand of raising somebody from the dead physically and made her alive, but also made that unclean woman's she made her come alive as well, lifting her shame from her, and then telling her that she's healed and that she can go on and start her life again. And there was some commentary that said it was N.T. Wright who said, which I thought was really helpful, uh, that Jesus is obviously he's initiating, inaugurating his kingdom, and his kingdom is breaking in. The starting point for the breaking in of his community, for his kingdom, and for his renewal, and for his making life out of death is the channel of faith. That any person who has faith is experiencing the very first initial step to experiencing Jesus's new kingdom that has broken in. And so, he makes Jairus's daughter come alive, and then also socially and physically makes this. And there's a distinction here between this respected religious leader in the synagogue and also a rejected, unclean woman who is, they've disappeared her really, and Jesus sees her, and that was a part of my Jesus notices us. Um, so, again, there's like you guys, a couple of different really, really powerful moments that, on the one hand, I made the decision to walk the church through the story by referring to the text and probably dried it out too much and should have stuck with my gut, which is tell the story, even if you don't get it. You don't get every detail of it, tell the story. But, there's so much richness there.
Yeah, it was everything you guys said. We touched on. It was so funny because during our prep, it almost seemed like everybody had unique messages. The way I'm hearing it is like we all kind of preached very, very similarly. And I really hung my hat on at the end to two things: the words of Jesus, "Don't be afraid, just believe." He doesn't dismiss his grief, right? He addresses the grief and says, don't be afraid," and then he gives them a solution to the grief. Belief. And it was just this. I had the same issue. Like we were in the middle of the nameless woman, and we were preaching, and we could have ended it there. And so we had to fast forward just a little bit. But the fact that Jesus didn't criticize their faith, we had all looked at that potentially their faith wasn't fully formed, and I think that that was a really a beautiful landing spot for our church, where we don't have to have a fully formed faith. We don't have to know everything. We don't have to have everything figured out. What we need to do is still come to Jesus with
Yeah.
whatever faith we have. And I just brought it back to Mark chapter 4, and that faith of a mustard seed. And I think that was a very relieving moment. You could almost feel like an exhale, like, oh man, I don't have to have it all together to get to Jesus, as long as I get to Jesus with what I got. And it was a beautiful moment there. And just co-signing everything everybody said. We said similar things as well.
I wish I had time to unpack the responses of people to Jesus, which is, um, it's too late, right? No need to get ourselves to Jesus or get him to my need because it's too late. Weeping and wailing, right? Like total despair. And
Yeah.
then some were at the point where they believed him so little it was like cynicism when they laughed. He's like, "Hey, she's not dead, she's asleep," and they laughed at him. I mean,
Yeah.
those are three really seemingly meaningful responses that would have been fun to unpack a little bit.
I think the thing I wish I had a little more, taken a little more time. I actually did push in a little bit on that first one, Dan, which was the teacher, don't bother the teacher any longer. And I
Mm-hmm.
just kind of talked about the capacity of a person to help you with certain things. I kind of use the illustration of my limited ability to help my teenage girls with their math because it's so far beyond what I remember and it's different now. And the idea that, they can stop bothering me with their math because I'm of no use to them. And it implies the way the crowd saw Jesus. Like he's a good teacher. I mean, they call him that. And yeah, he might be a healer, but like we don't need a healer anymore. We need the resurrection and the life.
Yeah.
And he's not that, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so just this lack of understanding, of course, of who he was. But afterwards, I was talking to a church member, and they were saying, I wonder how Jairus's faith was increased by seeing what happened to the woman, but then immediately derailed by the news your daughter is dead. Like I didn't really think about or talk about it all the way in which Jairus's experience with this healing moment
Yeah, his hope was
my
like 100 out of 100 at that point.
right gave him the faith to go, oh, this is going to work out well. I mean, if this
Yeah.
lady who really probably doesn't deserve this
Yep.
gets this, imagine what my daughter's going to get. Next news, your daughter's dead. That
Yeah.
sort of back and forth and the emotional roller coaster of life. And to Danny's point about faith, that was such a big moment for us, for me to encourage the room and say, man, this lady's faith is not perfect. Point of this story is not be her and get your healing. Her faith is not perfect for a variety of reasons. We use the phrase, it's not about the perfection of your faith, but the direction of your faith. And that she could have had a lot of faith. She could have had better faith than other people in the crowd, but the least amount of faith in Jesus is more valuable than the greatest amount of faith in anyone or anything else. And I just let people know it doesn't matter if your faith is shaky, inconsistent. If you feel like you don't have as much faith as you had 2 weeks ago or 2 years ago, like the whole point is pointed at Jesus. Like whatever faith you have, pointed at him. And I felt the room go, okay, I can do that.
I was heavy hearted during the message, really from start to finish, because we have a room full of people that have been battling chronic illness,
Yeah.
and have been waiting and seeking, and they went through all those. They've gone through all those. It's too late. They've gone through weeping and wailing. They've gone through, um, what's the last one there? Laughter. Like this is. I'm so cynical now. And also, it's interesting too that it seems like anybody who's walked with Jesus and really gets to know who he is, it really does end the way that passage ended, which is they were overwhelmed with awe. Like they were amazed with awe. Like if you're, no matter what the circumstances are, if you really do get to see and believe who this Jesus is with your little bit of faith, there is an abiding joy despite what happens. Of course, it wouldn't hurt to have one of those healing experiences where you're made alive. But I felt the heaviness of there's a lot of people that see themselves in this story and it's not going that way for them.
For sure. For sure.
And I made that point. I slowed when it got to Jairus. I had to slow down. So I wanted them to feel the weight of the moment for Jairus, and I had to make this clarification. I said, um, God may not always heal, but He's always faithful.
Mm.
And I think that's an important note to make, because we can't guarantee, to what David said earlier, we're not guaranteeing healing. What we're guaranteeing is faithfulness. And whatever that faithfulness looks like according to Jesus, we have to trust him for that outcome. And I think that that's a big distinction that we need to make. And it was just, to your point, Dan, is the weight of the room was, we slowed down. There wasn't a lot of amens in that moment, but we understood that it was time to really trust God for whatever outcome what was gonna happen in our lives.
Mm-hmm.
That's good. I couldn't tell if it landed in the room or not, but I talked about that a little bit, the willfulness or the willingness of Jesus, but also the willfulness of Jesus, that he's a person. So he has his own will and plans and purposes, and his willingness is contained by his willfulness, or his power is contained by his choosing, and being able to trust him in that. And knowing, of course, at the end of the story, that even though he reaches into death and pulls this girl out, most of us will never have that experience. We'll die a natural death and that'll be it. Yet, of course, because of what he ends up doing, he may not pull each of us out of natural death, but he carries us through death, right, to life. And so
So good.
that's the hope and joy. Thanks, guys. Great Sunday. What a text. What a story. And this week we're on to John chapter 6, Jesus and the miracle of the feeding of the 5,000.